Right, so for those of you who attended the session a couple of weeks ago or previous sessions, this is just a bit of a recap really, and to just help situate us. So this is the cycle of good impact practice, which was developed by Inspiring Impact, and Angela will share the link. It's a really useful website, lots of resources and tools and worksheets, and really designed for people and organisations that are new to impact measurement and impact management. And this is quite a sort of useful way of trying to frame how you approach all of this. And so there's the planning stage, and that's where a theory of change and developing a theory of change kind of fits in and starts. So basically sort of planning how you want to create your desired impact, really thinking about the problem you're seeking to address, and your proposed solution, and who that is for, who your stakeholders are, who your target audience is. The do bit is the actual impact measurement bit. And I think in the past we've just called the whole cycle impact measurement, and you know, the language is always changing. You now hear impact practice, impact management, but the real sort of measurement bit is the doing bit. So that's when you're delivering your services, your activities, your interventions, and collecting information, whether that's through surveys, observing, you know, all sorts of different ways of collecting data, in which we run learning labs on. So take a look at that. And you're pulling all of this information together, and kind of storing it somewhere, whether that's on bits of paper or in a system, but you're pulling it together. Then there's the assessing phase. So it's just trying to make sense of all the different information you've collected, whether that's quotes and stories, or you've got more of sort of the numbers side of things. And just, yeah, sort of seeing if you can spot any trends, any kind of anything particularly significant, anything unusual, anything unexpected. And we can also point you in the direction of resources and people and other organisations that can help you with the assessing stage and develop that set of skills. And then the fourth piece, the fourth stage is, I mean, they call it reviewing, but it's reviewing. It's sort of seeing what you've learned from that data, and using those insights from your assessment to think about how can you actually improve what you're doing. What have you learned? What will you change? How will that inform your decision making? And also, how are you sharing that information? Are you feeding it back to your service users, to your trustees, to the public? How are you communicating that? And I think over the last year or so, you know, our partners and what I think we're all realizing is that this cycle needs to be much more rapid. And you're hearing a lot more about sort of how more agile ways of working can really help. While there's so much uncertainty, you might be testing new ways of doing things. So you want to think about maybe speeding up that cycle so you can learn a bit more quickly, and adapt more quickly. And I think there is an advantage to being a smaller organisation. That's my assumption, but it might be a little bit easier to adapt quickly. So that's just sort of where it fits in, and then just also thinking about what the key ingredients we think we have through our experience and listening to others, and what sort of those good ingredients look like. So we talk about leadership. Here we mean leadership, you know, not just from the top, not just from the trustees. It's not the sort of gaining rank type of leadership, but really, I quite like the Brené Brown definition of a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for recognising the potential in people and ideas and has the courage to develop that potential. So that might be within your volunteers, frontline staff, people from all levels of the organisation. That ties in, sort of feeds into having a really open learning culture, making sure all voices are heard, involving as many people in your impact practice, and at the board level as well, being honest and open and willing to change and act on what you find, and sort of actively sharing your findings with others. Data collections, just making sure that that it's reliable and ethical, and that you are really thinking about who is designing the questions that you're asking. Where possible, can you involve your service users, and what's proportionate for you as an organization. You know, do you have the resources to run focus groups all the time? You know, really sort of think about that. And I think that a big advantage is that increasingly there are lots of really brilliant digital tools, a lot of them free, that can help you with data collection. This point around the cycle of making sure you just don't stay at, oh well, I've collected some data, we've run a survey. Really think about that cycle so that you're really managing, you're assessing, you're learning, and it's feeding into decision making. And then just having a clear purpose. What does impact actually mean to you as an organization? Impact as an organization, and then for your specific programs, really think about that. What's your purpose? What's your why? And this is going to underpin your theory of change, which we'll now come on to. So, why create a theory of change? So I hope I'm not sort of overcomplicating this, but I just want to give you a chance to use a digital tool that we find handy that you might be able to use with some of your services. So Angela is going to share a link with you in the chat. You just click on it. And have I included the right code there? Oh, so ignore the code that I've included in this slide and just follow the link that Angela has shared. Sorry, I haven't updated that link. If you can't manage it, don't worry at all. And in the chat, if you like, or unmute yourself, just think, why create a theory of change? So why are you here today? And just share some of those reasons. What do you think the value is to creating a theory of change before we actually dive into what it is and how to do it. So, oops, if there are any issues with the link, just let us know. Okay, some good answers coming in. And you can answer multiple times. And for those of you who have submitted your responses, if you come back to the Zoom screen, I have shared my screen, my sort of mentor screen, so you can start seeing, you can see some of the responses, and there's also a link that Angela can share for you. So we've got. So they gave me 400. Whoever's just joined, would you mind muting yourself? Thank you, thank you. Okay, so I'll read out some of the answers in case you can't see them. So developing a new project, a team building exercise, understand your organization makes an impact, drive service improvement, some really great examples here. And what I will do is you can then share this, you can create a PDF. So I will share this with you in the follow-up email. But these are all really, really great reasons and really tie in more generally to kind of why do impact management. So it shows what a useful planning tool or theory of change is. Have clarity, absolutely. As a North Star or compass, yeah, I really, really like that analogy. Adapt our need. Monitor whether you're doing a good job, and we'll come on to that. We'll come on to sort of how theory of change then feeds into your kind of measurement and monitoring and evaluating process. Great, there's some really good things in here. And I'll take a bit of time afterwards to look through them a bit more carefully. So thank you for sharing your thoughts there. So Mentimeter, another useful tool. For those who I can see, has anyone used Mentimeter before? Thumbs up? No, you haven't? Okay, great. Really, really useful tool. It's free. All I did is I created an account. We'll share the link. I created an account, and you can do all sorts of things. You can do different kinds of polls. You can do votes. You can do quizzes. And yeah, just really, really handy little tool. So there's Mentimeter, the Zoom poll, and also worth noticing, just thinking about the digital tools we've used for this event, is Eventbrite. So if you are just running an event on Eventbrite, there's a way of adding in questions as someone is registering to make the process sort of more smooth and find out, collect a bit of sort of baseline information from your participants. So that's Mentimeter. So part of the reason for that exercise is also to show you that tool. And we get lots of tips from a fantastic organization called Superhighways, who are always in the know on sort of affordable, low cost, free data and digital tools for small organizations. So that's great. Thank you, everyone. So we will now sort of dive into actually what is a theory of change. And for anyone who was here at the beginning of the call, we're sort of saying there isn't really a standardized framework or definition for a theory of change. So these are some of the things that I find useful when thinking about what it actually is. So ultimately, it's kind of a description of how you do good, of how your activities and your programs contribute to positive impact. So it captures all the positive changes, and it's got that slightly sort of aspirational feel to it, captures change. And yeah, it captures that sort of why of a project, your sort of purpose of a project or an organization. And there might be some overlap with sort of mission and vision statement if you're doing a theory of change for your whole organization. It will be completely unique to your organization as well. It's a planning tool. As we saw in that cycle, can help you kind of review and identify the difference your organization is making. It's a foundation for your strategic document. So our theory of change is in our business plan. And so I see it as sort of theory of change is your why and your purposes, and your strategy is, well, how are you actually going to make that happen? It's also a foundation for evaluation. So we'll come on to that, but a theory of change isn't a sort of a measurement tool. It's not where you're going to include all your indicators and measures, but it will underpin that and help you think about, okay, well, what are our resources? What is it that we want to test in our theory of change? And so what should we measure? And it's also, yeah, it's a learning tool, that sort of the exercise of taking your organization through it, and a communication tool, so you can have different types of theories of change, and thinking about your different audiences. Maybe the theory of change that sits on your website might look a bit different to a theory of change you might share with a funder or a strategic partner. Developmental versus descriptive. So I've seen it sometimes described in this way, and really what that means is, so a descriptive theory of change is the exercise you would do to describe the change that you're already bringing about, and the programs that you're running, or you're sort of describing what your organization does. You know, it'll still have that aspirational feel to it. But compared to developmental, which is when you can use the theory of change exercise to develop a completely new program, new project. So that's the difference there. And then organization versus program. So you can sort of do a high level organization-wide theory of change, or do one for your specific programs. You know, you don't necessarily need to have an organization one and then one for every program. It's really just about thinking what is going to be useful to you. So come back to that why, like what's your reason for creating this theory of change, and what's going to be useful to you. Sometimes an organization wide can be quite tricky. If you think of an organization like Oxfam, for example, you know, works in so many different areas and different countries, and you know, pulling all of that together is going to be much more challenging. So just come back to what's useful for you. For us, we find, because we're quite we're a small organisation, we're quite focused. Our theory of change does work sort of across for our organisation. This point about it being a process, it's not just about the end product and creating a nice PDF that you can attach to funding bids or put on your website. It's really about the process and who you're involving. You can be really creative there with how you involve other people. You can involve service users, stakeholders, whether it's in the actual creative process or in the sort of feedback process afterwards. And we'd normally encourage both to sort of back up any kind of diagram with a narrative document. And again, there's no sort of set rules of what to include in that narrative document, but what you might want to talk about the process and who was involved, and sort of various bits of information that aren't captured in the diagram. And then this point about it being a live document, and so think about, in the same way you would review your strategic plan, sort of come back to it, make sure you keep coming back to it, and it's maybe helpful if one person in particular is sort of takes ownership of it.
Just a comment from Shell, saying many funders, especially the Ministry of Justice, ask for theory of change in the funding bid. This makes it sound more that it is one for all. Shell, I don't know whether you want to say anything more about your comment?
Yeah, it was just like that. As I said, I've done a bit of theory of change before, and it's so diverse. There's so much to it. But I know I have done some more recent funding bids, and in all of them, they put in, we want to see theory of change in with these funding bids. And I'm always a bit sort of stuck as to what exactly do you want to see in there, sort of in relation to theory of change. So yeah, I'm hoping this is going to draw that out for me.
Okay, I'm hoping so too. Well, yes. So we'll take you through the next sort of section, and we'll look at different examples and what we've identified are the steps. I think what I would like to highlight is that, of course, we recognise that funding is absolutely essential to achieving your impact as organisations. But for us, we really want to focus on helping you develop tools and use tools that are really going to further your own learning and your own improvement. Understanding that there will be some things that you just might not feel that sort of useful to you, but it's what a funder is asking for. And so of course you need to weigh that up. But there is no kind of fixed theory of change. There are, in the international development world, you've got logic models. There are all sorts of theory of change has become an umbrella term for lots of different ways of trying to present this information. And if we come on to this next slide, this is what we've identified, for a small organisation, some of the key elements of building block steps to think about when developing your theory of change. We'll also be sharing a link to the MPC guide, and they really are sort of experts in this and develop theories of change for all sorts of organisations, and including funders. And they recently updated their guidance on developing theory of change, and it's actually a 10-step guide. We here are just including 7, because we're just sort of thinking, if you're making a start and you include these elements, then it's a sort of solid theory of change as far as we're concerned. And again, it's about coming back to like the sort of the process and the why and what you're getting from it. So thinking about these steps, and here it's just an introductory session. We do run sort of more in-depth workshops specifically for organisations, and help to facilitate that process, so you can have someone facilitating externally, and our volunteers help to do this as well. So that's not what this session is for, because we don't have enough time. So this session is hopefully going to leave you with an idea of kind of tools and ideas for how for how to get started. And of course, you can always get back in touch with us. So these steps, it's also the order of the steps, I think, is important. So rather than thinking about what we do, these are our different programs and activities. Start with the context, what's the situation that you're dealing with, and you are experts in that. And so anyone who's externally facilitating that process will recognize that. So really thinking about context, understanding the problem. Is there any external data that you can look at to understand sort of what's going on in the local community and sort of the broader context? Any existing information that you already have from previous programs or previous evaluations or reports. So really think about that. And I guess the step before here is deciding, are you doing it for your whole organization, or are you doing it for a specific program? Are you describing what you already do, or are you developing something new? You then come to sort of the situation, really think about your target group. You might also want to think about stakeholders who will sort of negatively or positively influence the situation. And then it's coming on to this big impact question. Sort of what is your ultimate goal? What does sort of success look like for your communities that you serve? It's something that you can influence as an organization, and it really articulates the change that you want to see, and identifies who you're trying to serve as well. So really starting off with a kind of the change, and then the outcomes is a level down. And I've got a graphic, I think, in the next slide, just to help either remind people or show people what we mean with sort of the difference between outputs and outcomes. But outcomes is also about sort of change, but it's more immediate or shorter term changes that result from your activities. And they need to be very kind of clear and succinct, not be fused together. And we can share some resources on, how to develop outcomes. There are also lots of outcome kind of banks out there. There's the Good Finance Outcomes Matrix, which I really recommend. So there, you can take a look at that and see if there are any outcomes that you think are relevant to your organisation and your target group. And include that. So it's a bit of a brainstorming exercise, all the different outcomes, and then you might want to think about, grouping them, and see if you can pull different ones together, because you want to have as many ideas and suggestions as possible. And then when you review them, you might notice that actually, is this really an outcome for us? Or is this actually an activity? Does this outcome belong actually to one of our partners? You can sort of go through that exercise. And outcomes might be changes in knowledge. And so outcomes for us, for Learning Labs, will be an increase in knowledge around impact measurement. Attitudes, so beliefs and values, changes in behaviours, changes in skills, changes in a kind of in conditions, so just circumstances, someone's personal state, and then also changes in opportunity, so availability of services and programs, inclusion, accessibility, those are also outcomes. And it's really putting yourself in the shoes of your target groups. What do you want them to think or feel or do differently within a few days, weeks or months? And that all kind of feeds into your broader impact goal. And then after that, you start identifying your activities that directly help to feed into those outcomes. Some of them might be, you'd hope there'd be a lot of existing activities. Well, it depends if you're starting and developing for a new program or not, but really it's trying to make sure that all those activities do actually feed into those outcomes. And then when thinking about these activities, you might notice that you've missed out a few outcomes as well. You then want to just sort of take a step back and think about, well, what are the assumptions? What are the assumptions that we're making, and just sort of sense check what you've come up with. Bring in other people, and those assumptions, those kind of core beliefs that you hold, you might also want to test them when it comes to collecting data later on. You don't necessarily, you don't often see assumptions included in the diagram of a theory of change, but it's just good to take yourself through that exercise and just sort of check that there aren't any, just to sort of identify any biases. And the more people you have involved in the process, then the more kind of robust the exercise will be. The sequencing just means it's about the logic. So step back and think, okay, once you've tidied it all up, is there a clear link between your activities? Do they lead to outcomes? Sometimes you can add some arrows in there, although, change is quite messy and it sometimes is quite a difficult exercise to link it all up. But just making sure that there is that clear logical thread between what you do and the change that you want to see and your broader impact goal, and that it's addressing the problems that you've identified. And then finally, it's just sort of thinking about how you want to capture it. There are things like Canva, for anyone who we've just started getting into Canva, and it's a really fantastic tool. Again, there's a free non-profit version, and it's basically a way of creating your own infographics and posters. So you could turn it, give it a nice graphic design to include it on your website, or it could just be our theory of change at the moment is just in a PowerPoint slide, or you can put it in a Word document and just have the different boxes. So it's sort of up to you to think about how you want to capture it. So those.
Sorry, there's just a question from Paulina.
Yeah.
As a result of the situation, do you need to frame a problem or challenge that then leads to the change you want to make?
It's a really good question. So yes, we have, that is sometimes sort of in that situation exercise. You can also think about doing like a problem tree or an issues tree to help you dig a bit deeper. So yes, absolutely. Make sure that you are kind of really, really clear on what that problem is. We find a lot of organizations, by the time we start working with them, are kind of reasonably clear on what the problem is. Having said that, with the last year, things are changing so quickly, so it does need to be revisited. And Paulina, I think that's why, using people like you, sort of our volunteers, have that kind of skill set to help organisations develop develop those sorts of problem trees, or sort of support them with that. So yes, you want to make sure that that's clear. So I'm just going to break you up into pairs, just also so you have a chance to say hello and not hearing my voice the whole time. And it's a simple question, really. Just introduce yourselves and your organisation and just have a think about what is the long-term impact of your work. It might be quite clear to you. If you'd rather focus on a specific programme, that's fine as well. But it's thinking about that second step. What is that sort of longer term? What is that sort of longer term impact that you're wanting to contribute to? So it's that step that we're thinking about. So I'm going to put you into just groups of two. So for those of you who've attended one of our sessions before, we often use this in our general introductory session. So this is a theory of change. If you look at that the right-hand column of the project, and this is just a really useful graphic to explain the difference between the activities and outputs, and then the outcomes. So the outcomes is where you're really trying to capture that change. In this example, they have included inputs, so whether that's the cake ingredients or for the project, money, staff, resources. But I don't really so often now see inputs included on a theory of change. Traditional logic models would often have that. That doesn't, I think it doesn't really tell you so much about the change that you're trying to see, so that you can think about leaving that off. Also here you've got both activities and outputs, and really outputs is just sort of the direct sort of, results of the activity. So it's the actual kind of product or service. So you might just have activities rather than outputs, but outputs is helpful to think about when you move across to the measuring stage, and you're trying to think about, well, what do we need to count, like how many people are receiving counselling, how many sessions that we're running. And they haven't included impact here. And so if we're going to take this sort of the cake analogy further, it might be something about, you know, contributing to a really kind of like a sort of happy family or happy community or reduced hunger or whatever it is that the kind of outcome is feeding into. And for the actual project, is it about trying to reduce, you know, improve mental health within a certain community? So I think that's just a helpful illustration specifically around the outputs and outcomes, about trying to capture that change. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you including these elements in a theory of change. So here is the planning triangle, and there's more information on this. It was developed by NCVO, well, formerly Charities Evaluation Service, which now belongs to NCVO. So they've got resources about planning triangle, and it's just a very kind of simple way to get started. And it is a theory of change, but it just has these three components. So you have your broader impact statement. So this is for a prison employment project at the top. The middle row is those more sort of shorter term changes that they want to bring about, and then all the activities that they're going to run. And it still helps you, you can then do the sort of testing and think, okay, these different activities, are there any activities that sit outside of this triangle and aren't feeding into the outcomes? Should we be running them? In some cases, for some social enterprises, for example, it might be that they are running activities that don't directly feed into outcomes, but is maybe helping to fund those activities. So that's just a simple planning triangle, and can be just a good way to get started. And then here we've got a different way of representing it. So this is an example from our DataWise London programme, a consortium that we're part of, which is led by Superhighways, I mentioned earlier. And so this is sort of another way of capturing it. So in the middle, you've got that outcomes, sort of what you might call an outcomes pathway. So when you're doing a big brainstorm of all these different changes that come about, it might start to become quite clear when you start grouping them that there are some that are much more sort of shorter term and immediate, and that need to happen first in order for that sort of individual to move across. And then you can start doing a bit of sort of linking and sequencing and sort of tracking, well, you know, if they're building a relationship with a mentor, that will help them to feel more comfortable about making mistakes. And, you know, packed into all of this is lots of assumptions, which is why you need to keep coming back and testing it and sharing it with others. But you can see the sort of the logical thread there. This is, I just wanted to include an example of, I guess I would describe this as a more advanced theory of change. It's not relevant to you as small organizations as such. But it's the way that you can capture a theory of change for a kind of partnership or a consortium. So this is the Youth Investment Fund, and they've come up with different theories of change for their kind of, for different groups, and this is specifically for the grantees. So yeah, for the different youth, I think it's all about sort of open access youth provision, and the different organisations, and where there are these sort of shared outcomes. So not all of their grantees will deliver every activity, but they've grouped them together. And here you can see that they've got several impacts. And the accountability line is basically saying that we are kind of assuming that the outcomes we're helping to bring about will lead to that, but there are so many other factors that will help, that will lead to, say, improving their physical health, that we can't, we're not going to hold ourselves accountable for that. So we go as far as this line. And then mechanisms of change you can read about in that. It's one of the extra steps in the 10-step guide from New Philanthropy Capital. And the idea is they want to try and capture, what do the young people need to feel and experience while they're participating in the activities, in order for these outcomes around values and attitudes and those changes to happen. And so maybe an example for our work at CFE through our Measuring the Good programme, where we match volunteers to organisations as facilitators, what needs, there are mechanisms of change is making sure that there's a really kind of trusting and open relationship, because if there isn't a trusting and open relationship, then it's unlikely that the outcomes that we'll hope to bring about in an organisation around developing their impact practice will actually happen. So that's the sort of interesting thing that you might want to play around with. Sometimes you might just sort of read a mechanism of change and think, well, that just sounds like an outcome, and that's how we're going to include it. But I just wanted to add that here, and we'll include the link to, there's a really great sort of blog on how they've developed it and really kind of explaining just the narrative document that supports this. So just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour. So here we've got a template, and Angela's going to share a link to a Google Doc with just a couple of templates to get you started, that if you want to play around with. So if we go back to those steps, is that first thinking about a situation, and really defining the problem that you're dealing with, and identifying that, and sort of diagnosing it and thinking about the change you want to bring about. You then got that sort of bigger impact statement or impact statements. You'll then want to do that sort of outcomes brainstorming. Think about, do you want to group them into whether it's different sort of changes in behaviours or attitudes or skills, depending on your different programmes, and short-term, medium-term, longer-term. Your activities. Sorry, Kudo isn't supported in this region. Sorry, my phone's listening in to our learning lab. Activities, and then the sort of the assumptions, just sort of thinking through it, or make sure you're capturing them, and then thinking about the sequencing. So this is just a sort of what we think are some of the key steps, and it's just a really useful exercise to take your team through. And just a reminder that, the change when you're working with people can be very messy, can be very complex, and it's going to be, I think, almost impossible to capture exactly the change that you're bringing about. There are so many different factors and circumstances. And, for us, when we think about our theory of change, an organisation's starting point is always going to be so different. So the journey for each organisation that we support will be very different. And so you can't create an individual theory of change for absolutely every organisation or individual that you're supporting. So just come back to, why is this useful? It's been really good sort of team building exercise. It's helped you to identify that there are some gaps. Maybe there are different activities that you can be running, or maybe, it's maybe helping you think about some of your assumptions. Yeah, just don't hold on sort of too tightly to it. Know that you can come back and review it and tweak it.
There's just a question from Neil, which I've just responded to. So he was asking, are there any ways of showing theories of change that include barriers to getting those impacts? Is that useful? Is that best left to risk analysis description? So I suggested sort of having a narrative document accompanying the theory of change that outlines assumptions or potential barriers. But if you...
Yeah, but I think that's not to say you can. I've gone with quite sort of straightforward, more like traditional examples of, kind of from left to right, but you can get quite creative with your theory of change. And if there's other information that you do want to include and you think kind of fits and works there, and you can communicate that in a visual way, then by all means. But anything that you feel you can't or needs more explaining, then absolutely include that in the narrative document. So I think that one of the other sections, if I'm not mistaken, in the 10 steps guide, which I really recommend you read through, talks about like enabling factors, and so that maybe is where sort of barriers can come in. So both what's like enabling you to do the work, so other stakeholders, for example, but also some of the barriers. Right, so just going to look at the time. Angela, have you managed to share that link to the Google Doc?
Yes, I've shared it.
Okay, great. What I think we'll do, just looking at the time, is so just a reminder of where it all fits in to the cycle of good impact practice. So we've been looking at that kind of the planning phase. And I just wanted to share with you an impact framework that Angela and I have pulled together and occasionally tweak, and just quickly share it with you to just sort of help you think about, okay, you've done this theory of change exercise, but how does that actually then translate to your data collection? So Angela's shared a link, but I will also share my screen for those of you who can't access the link. So 1 second. So just to kind of guide you through this document, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the sort of measurement side of it, but on the first page is a sort of title page and reminding you like when this document was last reviewed. You can just copy this or download it as an Excel and do whatever you want with it. You can delete tabs, you can add tabs. It really is just a sort of a suggestion. In the first section, you've got something around the situation and helping you think about the sort of the context and scope and target groups and stakeholders. There's some suggestions for a stakeholder plan. We've then got some tips on theory of change with a link to some templates and to some guides. If once you've done your theory of change, we suggest that you can sort of translate some of those outputs and outcomes into an Excel spreadsheet, because this is where you want to start thinking about how are we going to measure, what are we going to measure, because you're not going to be able to measure absolutely every outcome that is in your theory of change, because there might be some that you don't necessarily need to, that you can say pretty confidently that you don't need to track that in detail, you don't need to test it. So you translate your theory of change into one of these tabs, whether it's for your organization or whether it's for an individual program. And then all of that then feeds into your data and measurement plan. The third tab is talking about different types of data, which I'm not going to jump into now, but this is what we cover in our other sessions. It's that sort of that measurement bit. What is it that you're actually going to collect, and how you collect it and how to frame that. And then if you look at the tab that says data and measurement plan, this is how you start to translate, okay, what are the activities that you've captured in your theory of change, and what is the immediate result or product of that activity? How many workshops? How will you track that? Is it in kind of through Eventbrite or attendance sheets, etc.? And then thinking about outcomes, and then up to you to decide which columns you want to keep. This is just to help you track how you're then actually going to collect each piece of data. If you want to set any targets for that, whose responsibility it is, and also how you're actually going to use that information. Will that go into sort of board minutes or for funders? We've also added a learning log. So for that, for that sort of final stage, just to help you think about sort of different lessons. We've got quite a few columns in here, so there might be a bit much, too much detail. You can also just simplify it, but just to kind of log discussions that you're having that might feed into decision making. And then watch this space. We are going to be adding a further tab for what we think would make a decent sort of one-page impact report. So what are those key pieces of information? So there'll be some elements from a theory of change, some elements from data that you've collected, maybe some tips on how to put that impact report into something like Canva. So that's a sort of on the communicating your impact side. So we might add to that, but if you have this link, you can just you can keep coming back to it. And like I said, you can download it or just create a new copy. So that was just to sort of help you kind of frame where theory of change sits, so that it doesn't just so that you don't just leave it there, and it does feed into that impact cycle. Sorry, lots of chopping and changing screen-wise today. And so just in terms of getting started, you know, you've already made a start. You started reflecting on you know, what that sort of bigger impact goal is. You might want to sort of check in with the situation and the context again, with everything that's going on. I know it's unpredictable times, so just to sort of revisit that. And there are lots of tools out there, sort of problem trees, issue trees, to help you sort of diagnose problems. Come back to, you know, why are you developing a theory of change, and how is it going to be useful to you? What's the scope? You know, what level are you doing it at? You know, the system is in there because sometimes you'll have multiple organizations coming together, and you're kind of trying to think about it at that more systemic level. Who do you need to involve and when? Who do you want to involve in these conversations, these meetings, these workshops? Can you get trustees involved? Can you get service users involved? If not, can you at least sort of share and get their feedback? Are you able to get external facilitation? So obviously for small organisations, the consultancy fees for theory of change workshops can be prohibitively high, but it might be that you can actually, with the tools that we're giving you, facilitate it yourselves, or get a volunteer to do it. And it's what, through our sort of Measuring the Good programme, we can help you with. But just make sure that the approach is really practical for you. And just a little quiz. Are there any guesses to actually who these quotes belong to? So best is the enemy of the good, or better a diamond with a flaw than a pebble without. Any guesses? I can't actually see the chat, but anyway, the first is, because I looked this up because I didn't know, but it's Voltaire, apparently, the first one, and the second one.
The suggestion of Boris Johnson.
I love it. And the second is Confucius, but the message here is, you know, I'm still go back to our theory of change and think, oh, it doesn't quite sit right, and we're now using different language, and this should move there. You know, that's okay. It's never going to be perfect. And that spreadsheet that we shared with you, you know, there are going to be gaps, and that's okay. Just come back to what's important and what you need to know. In terms of how we can help you, there are more learning labs coming up. Angela's running a few brilliant sessions over the next month or two. We have our impact chats, which is just a 1 hour check-in with either myself or Angela to really talk about any impact challenge that you have. And we're able to run those for free. If you're a Lloyds Bank Foundation grantee, thank you, Neil, for helping us get that set up, then you can access it through them. And we've also got a little bit of funding from the lottery to run those. So we're hoping to be able to continue offering those as part of our core support. And then there's the Measuring the Good program that I've mentioned a few times. So that's where you basically join a step-by-step program. It's not prescriptive, so it's really about identifying what's going to help you as an organisation and where you need most support. And then we match you to one of our volunteers, and you also receive support from us and from the Measuring the Good team to take your organisation through certain steps, and thinking about that impact cycle. And this is the 10-step theory of change that I mentioned. This is a sketch by Mandy Johnson, who does these really brilliant sort of sketch notes. So this, just as a bit of a recap, you've got the situation analysis, who are the people you're trying to help, that longer term change, what are the shorter term outcomes, what activities are you going to do, round to those change mechanisms that we saw in that Youth Investment Fund theory of change, making sure it all links together. What does that diagram then look like? They've got a planning triangle there, all your different stakeholders and enabling factors. And then what is the thinking that underlines your plan? So they put assumptions as a sort of the final step in all of this. And so that's quite a sort of handy visual. We've got a little glossary here, which we'll share with you, just to help sort of remind you of these key differences. And I would now invite you, just looking at the time, to just have a think about, with everything that we've sort of thrown at you today, you've had a little bit of a chance to kind of reflect. But if you could do something just in the next 7 days based on the different things that I've shared with you, what would you do in the next 7 days to help you get sort of a step closer to developing a theory of change for a project or your organisation? And if you'd like to share it either in the chat or unmute yourselves, then please do.